we cover today. And there are folks who are on YouTube who have not been able to join us on Zoom. So it's just good to know that the community is there. For instance, Mary Alice Wester, who's a mainstay of our experience. Mary Alice is joining us on YouTube. So everybody say hi to Mary Alice. There we go. And there are about 20 others who've jumped in on YouTube as well. So hello to all of you. I'm going to do one other thing real quick, and that's let EJ in the room. EJ and Jim are both here. Okay. We need to review, as always. We'll spend about 10 minutes reviewing. And we got another person joining real quick. So let me get Victoria in the room. All right, so we want to review, and a big question for me is, where are we? I think we're in chapter 5, but maybe I read that and we didn't cover it in class. So I really don't remember, and I'm sorry for that. And I should have gone back and checked the YouTube video, and I didn't. So did we just only finish the two women and the splitting of the baby issue, or did we keep going? We kept going, right?
Oh, we went further. We went through to 5:34 and starting now with Hiram the king.
That's fantastic. So maybe 5:14, the introduction of Hiram the king at 5:15.
Oh yeah, I wasn't reading it well.
No, that's great. That's great. So we're now literally on the same page and verse. That's very good. So we're gonna start today at 5:15. 1 Kings 5:15. I'll let y'all find your places there.
I don't think we started chapter 5.
Oh yeah.
I don't think we started chapter 5.
All right, how about this? 5:1.
Good idea.
All right, that's good. And I think, again, we talked about this a little bit last week. There's a lot today will be a discussion about the building of the temple. And so we ought to be able to get to chapter 8 or so, which I think will start to catch us back up a little bit. Is there anything from chapters 3 and 4 that you want to make sure that we recall together? Anything worthy of review? Onward. All right, Hutch.
I think what we got after we went through the judgment of Solomon and this continuing discussion on wisdom, we moved on to the kingdom, which I think is fairly important. And you can look at it from the viewpoint of a secular kingdom. Mm-hmm. And we see in what we read the establishment of a secular kingdom. We see the establishment of a huge bureaucracy. I think all of chapter 4 was name calling of various high officials, administrators, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a bureaucracy, or if you want to use modern terminology, a deep state. And then we also, I think in chapter 3, another successful secular state, important alliances. Mm-hmm. He especially one with Egypt, a very powerful country at the time. And then we see, I think in chapter 4, a lot of, I would almost say, excessive pomp at the ruling level. Stables for 40,000 chariot horses, sumptuous dining and the provision thereof. So we see pomp. And then we haven't quite moved to it yet, but I was scanning chapter 5, conscription. Yes. In this case, conscription, forced labor for Solomon's various building projects.
Right. We had a little bit of that in chapter 4 too. Right. Yeah, very good.
And finally, in this secular kingdom, we see taxes. Allies are paying tribute, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. We see some of that in chapter 4. So we see a litany of a lot of this stuff that God said, here's what you're going to get if you have a kingdom.
That's right.
But interestingly, the reading takes a twist, at least it does in my idea. They've got a secular kingdom, is successful, and all is good. All is good. They point out in these sections that finally, if you look at the two preceding kingdoms, there's peace. If you look at Saul's reign and David's reign, there's sort of recurrent war going on all the time.
Right.
The second thing we see is the tribes are at peace with each other. This animosity between the tribe of Judah and the rest of Israel seems to have cooled down, and everybody's doing fine. And then we see that there's a line in there, I think around 420 or something, that the people are happy, whatever that means, they're happy. I think to quote it, they ate and drank and were happy.
Right.
And then
Good.
finally, around 420, we see almost a return to the Abrahamic covenant. The people of Israel and Judah were as numerous as the grains of the sea, and obviously they had land. So it looks like the kingdom is turning out to be perfectly good. And if I was concluding my bedtime story for my children, I would say they all lived happily ever after.
Yep. If only, right?
But such is not the case, because if we look at Old Testament, we still have 29 chapters, actually books to go.
Yeah, right.
So
That's right.
things don't turn out to be well, and we should stay tuned.
Yep. Very good, Hutch. Right. And if the preceding chapters have taught us anything, it's that these things come in cycles, and every era of prosperity will be matched with an era of syncretism or something to that effect, apostasy, and a turning away anyway. So we'll see how that goes. There's also that deep thread of what we keep calling family systems issues, right? Concerns that there are things embedded in Solomon's life that aren't his fault. He was just born into them, and his kids are born into them, and so on and so forth. And so we can expect some of that pain to resurface. Now, you did a really, really good job of recapturing for us that God had said, you don't want a king, because if you have a king, you're going to end up with forced labor and taxation and so on and so forth. And there were some warning signs, right? Like prior to that, God had said, look, you're not supposed to have chariots and horses and so on and so forth. That's what these other imperial nations do, like Egypt or Assyria or something like that. And here comes Solomon, married to Pharaoh's daughter, with thousands of chariots and horses, conscripted labor, taxation, so on and so forth. There's something about the retelling of the story that is certainly intended to show us that this is a golden age, while also intending to critique that golden age to a high degree. So very, very good. Okay, for the sake of it, anything else that we want to make sure that we see together before we move on? That's pretty good. Okay, Louise.
Just a quick follow-up that I think between chapter 3 and 5, we saw a step in the type of wisdom that God gave Solomon after he asked for it. And the two additions that came in 5 were, let's see, Yahweh gave Solomon immense wisdom. That's what he asked for, right? And understanding and a heart as vast as the sand on the seashore.
Right. Very good.
I love the fact that when Hutch was talking about another comment from God, that, or at least what the editor wrote, he also referred to as vast as the sand on the seashore. So I guess that's really a poetic convention that says really, really big.
Yeah.
Or
Yes,
expensive, you know. So anyway, I hope we see some more wisdom talk later, because the building is good, but I think the heart of our journey has to do with wisdom.
Yep, good. So yeah, we won't get any today, but there will be some conversations ahead about wisdom and justice, the way that those two things are related to one another. Very good. We spent a lot of time, it seems like last week, talking about the way in wisdom works from a divine perspective versus a human perspective, which I thought was helpful. That, one of the things that I noticed going back to the text since last week is that the things that Solomon has mastery of, the things that he speaks of in verse 13 or so of chapter 5, trees, beasts, birds, creeping things, and fish, that's the list of the created order in Genesis. That he has mastery from an intellectual perspective over all of these things and can speak about all of them. It's pretty cool, the tiebacks from time to time to Genesis, like the discernment between good and evil, which is what he asked for, or what God gave to him, which is just, really, really important themes there. Very good. One other thing that we talked about related to that, and Hutch touched on it, was that Solomon, or the people under Solomon, seem to be living in the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. And one of the things that we talked about was that the promise to Abraham had a purpose. It had a telos that was not simply the people's happiness, but instead the people's usefulness as a vehicle to convey God's blessing on the whole world, and that they have not quite done that yet. So we shouldn't see that as being fulfilled entirely, but at least a major step in the right direction. Okay, Hutch, do you have your hand back up?
Yeah, one final thing. As I reflected on this, this almost idyllic state that Solomon's kingdom has reached, my mind keeps going back to Judges. And the contrast is unbelievable as you reflect on Judges. It's a very dark book, and it seems like every 40 years or so, as the Bible puts it, the Israelites will always return to apostasy, idolatry, syncretism, and they would be invaded by hostile neighbors who wanted to wipe them out. A recurrent theme. And it's a dark book, and it gets darker towards the end, but then this recurrent sentence in Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did as he pleased. You contrast that state of existence in Israel with the time that Solomon's brought forth. Contrast is striking.
Yes, very, very good, right? At the very least, in the king, we have an embodiment of wisdom, of some sort of knowledge for God's purpose and God's will, which is very much in contrast with the last 4 chapters or so of Judges. So very, very good there. And just for the sake of it, let's recall that as we move into the books of Samuel, the period of the Judges morphs into the period of the monarchy, but it's still the case that Saul does whatever Saul wants to do. Remember how many times he consults with the oracles and then doesn't even wait for the answer. He just goes and does what he wants to do anyway. So we really do have something that stands in contrast to that. Though, again, jury's out on whether or not it stays that way. And it's worth just reminding ourselves that we have these dueling sources, one of which reports that Solomon is great and wonderful and exaggerates claims about how amazing Solomon is, and the other one subtly is always undermining that standpoint. And so here is Solomon, who is perfect in every way in his wisdom, doing what is right in the sight of Yahweh, and also not so much. So we'll take a look at that more and more. Okay, let's jump back into the text today. We got a ways to go, and a lot of detail to push through. So 5:1 is what I'm hearing. I don't have a good browser window up. Let me pull another one up. Have y'all looking at my Amazon shopping cart? All right, here we go. 5:1. King Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram had always been a friend to David. That might be true, that might be an alliance that David had. Tyre and Sidon are the two cities we'll have named here, and those are north of Israel on the coast, just very, very, very slightly. 20 miles north of the border, basically, if you're looking there now. Okay, Solomon sent word to Hiram saying, you know that my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until Yahweh put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. Here's that peace that we were talking about, right? The golden age. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. So I intend to build a house for the name of Yahweh my God, as the Lord said to my father David, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place shall build the house for my name. Therefore, command that cedars from the Lebanon be cut for me. My servants will join your servants. I will give you whatever wages you set for your servants, for you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. And this is all probably really historically accurate. When Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be Yahweh today, who has given to David a wise son to be over his great people. Hiram sent word to Solomon, I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I will fulfill all your needs in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. My servants shall bring it down to the sea from Lebanon. I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place that you indicate. I will have them broken up there for you to take away, and you shall meet my needs by providing food for my household. So Hiram supplied Solomon every need for timber, of cedar and cypress. Solomon in turn gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of fine oil. Solomon gave this to Hiram year by year. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him. There was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all of Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to the Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts, and they would be a month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon also had 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill country. Besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gebalites did the stone cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. Probably not a whole lot particularly exciting that we haven't already covered there, but just in case, anything you want to make sure that you point out?
Remington, I have a question. I know that the labor is forced, but are they paid in any way so they can take care of their families?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. Yes is the easiest answer. I should probably just say yes at the outset, that they would have been compensated. They would have been pulled away from whatever their normal labor was, and they would have been pulled away from land or business or whatever else to do this instead. And so it's not necessarily a good deal for them, but they would have been provided with room and board, and almost certainly there would have been something given to take care of their children and their household, so to speak, would be the easiest way to say that. Almost certainly. So we last week I used the terminology related to slaves and slavery, which is appropriate from the perspective of the narrator who wants us to see Solomon as becoming like Pharaoh. But at the same time, I think the narrator who's telling this story that wants us to see Solomon as just the great and mighty Solomon probably doesn't see that as a negative. Probably sees this as being an ordinary thing that would happen in the context of building a great nation. And so doesn't see this as being tantamount to the Hebrews being captive in Egypt. Yeah, Jim, 1 second.
It says here that he promised Hiram that he would give him wages to pay his men.
Well, yes, but that's Hiram's men, not the men of Israel who are being conscripted, right? So he has a trade deal with Hiram of Tyre and Hiram of Lebanon, we might say. But the people who are just hanging out in the hill country of Israel. He's just saying, you are my vassal, you are my subjects, and I will make you cut stones, and there's nothing you can do about it. But again, I don't think we need to go so far as to say that they were simply pulled into a labor camp and that was the end of it. I think, yeah, that's right. There is a difference between what was happening with this conscripted labor and the slave labor that the Hebrews provided to the Egyptians. It's fair to say that there's a difference there. All right. Anything else you noticed? Andy. Yep, Andy, go
Yeah, I
ahead.
just really like, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I really like verse 4 where they talk about rest. You know, we typically think of that as physical, but talks about having no adversaries and no evil occurrences, more of a spiritual rest.
Yeah. Good. It's almost like the if it weren't for all the stuff that's clearly not rest that's being named afterwards, we'd almost say like there's a certain Sabbath kind of state that people are entering into. There is no war, there is no famine. Everything is not stopped, but at rest, which is kind of nice. Good. All right. Anything else? Okay. Jump back into our text. And I don't think there's much else to look at there. The one thing I'll say is just, we have legendary material that's around here. If we take at face value that Solomon gets a lot of cedar and cypress, which there's no reason for us to doubt, or at least I don't think there's any reason for us to doubt. The place that it's going to come from are the forests of Lebanon. So this, as a description of the way that went down, is not only very likely, but really, I don't know, fascinating at some level. If this, well, let me say it this way: with the bureaucracy that Solomon is building, almost certainly there would have been some tablet somewhere that existed as a sort of receipt for this transaction. We've got those sorts of things in other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. And so there would have been other documentation, but that it's being recorded here is really a testament to how important they thought that this development was for the sake of this entire scene in which the temple and the house of Solomon, the palace, are being built. So it's kind of cool. Just from a historical perspective. Okay, chapter 6, verse 1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of Yahweh. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits wide across the width of the house. Its depth was 10 cubits in front of the house. For the house he made windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide. The middle one was 6 cubits wide. The third was 7 cubits wide. For around the outside of the house, he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should not be inserted into the walls of the house. I want to say a couple things really quickly as we kind of move forward. One is a cubit. A cubit is roughly the length from your elbow to your wrist, the little bone that sticks out of your wrist. And it would have been based on the average adult Israelite male. So we're looking something around 1.5 feet. If you thought of it as being about 18 inches, that would be helpful. So if you want to use that as a multiplier anywhere, 1.5 feet, that can be helpful. If something is 60 cubits long, that's probably 90 feet, something along those lines, right? And we'll see some things where that will actually matter. For the sake of it, I will say that I'll show you some pictures later on that can help you understand scale. But there's no need to try to keep track of all of the different details here unless something stands out to you as very interesting. All right, verse 7. The house was built with stone, finished at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the temple while it was being built. The entrance of the middle story was on the south side of the house. One went up by winding stairs to the middle story, and from the middle story to the third. So he built the house and finished it. He roofed the house with beams and planks of cedar. He built the structure against the whole house, each story 5 cubits high, and it was joined to the house with timbers of cedar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon. Concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise to you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. That is the signature of the Deuteronomist, remember? Verse 14, so Solomon built the house and finished it. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the rafters of the ceiling, he covered them on the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar from the floor to the rafters, and he built this within as an inner sanctuary as the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, remember? The house that is, the nave in front of the inner sanctuary was 40 cubits long. The cedar within the house had carvings of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. The inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost parts of the house to set there the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. The interior of the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. The important thing to see there is that it's a cube. He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the altar with cedar. Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. Then he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. Next, he overlaid the whole house with gold in order that the whole house might be perfect. Even the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary, he overlaid with gold. We will keep going here in a second. I see Scott has his hand raised. We want to get in with Scott. I'm eager for any of the breaks that we can take in these moments, so feel free to raise your hand or jump in. Go ahead, Scott.
I'm just struck by two things. One is, it's not very big. I mean, I would have expected something huge, gargantuan, and
Right.
really not that big. And then two is that what you mentioned, the Deuteronomistic signature. I mean, there's a reestablishment of the conditional deal. You
That's
gotta
right.
behave.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So remember the covenant with David was unconditional, right? I'm going to establish your throne forever. There will be punishment if you aren't good, but it's pretty unconditional. And now here again, I'm not going to dwell with you all unless you're pretty well perfect. So it's very, very conditional here again. Good thing to notice. And yes, the size. The one thing that I'll mention is that we're getting the description in these little chunks. So we'll get a room described, and then we'll get another room described and another room described. And each one of those is small. But if we were to keep adding and adding and adding, we'll see that the complex is growing significantly. So there may be a place here in a little bit where we get a much larger description of the whole complex. But one archaeologists suggest that it's almost as if we might better think of this as a series of storerooms. One of those storerooms being the storeroom for God, but all of the other storerooms being kind of appended onto that storeroom. And so not the sort of temple that we imagine. That temple gets built after this temple gets destroyed. The really massive temple complex comes first after the Babylonian captivity and then gets expanded upon by Herod the Great. Herod was really interested in making that temple complex much larger. So if you were to go to Israel now, and you can actually look at some places where there are different sort of strata of the types of stones that have been dug to build the temple complex. But like the Western Wall, the size and scope of that Western Wall, that was a retaining wall that was placed there to help build up the thing that's like Herod's work. That's 900 years after this. This is a much smaller deal than what became of it. Very good. Very, very good. Andy. Yep. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah,
You're ready.
quick question. Was there anything on the site before? Was there an altar or a synagogue? And what's the significance of the cube?
Right, good. So from the internal biblical perspective, what was there before was the threshing floor of the guy that at the end of 2 Samuel ends up giving that land, or the land is purchased from him. That becomes the site of the temple. From an archaeological perspective, there's a lot of debate. And that debate is born out of the fact that this temple doesn't exist anymore. And things were built on top of it that have been so sacred that you can't do a whole lot of digging around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem now. There is digging that happens, but it's not, nobody's going into the heart underneath the Dome of the Rock and digging up what's there to see if they can find pottery from 3,000 years ago. It's too sacrosanct. So there's no existing archaeological evidence for this temple. It's not that I don't think it probably exists. It's just that we don't have it. So there's a lot of conjecture that happens as a result. And one major line of conjecture over the last probably 150 years or so is that there was probably a Jebusite temple that was co-opted. And that what Solomon is doing is renovating something that was already extant. And now there's no good evidence for that either, but that has become the dominant counterpoint to what Scripture itself represents. And I should say, I should have brought a book where I could show you some things. There are really good scholarly works that show the debate, but at the end of it, you kind of have to work your way through it. And most of those are really quite esoteric, I'll say. Not that this class doesn't enjoy esoteric stuff. So there's the temple in ancient, I'm going to have to look up the title again. I'll share a title with you later on if you want to get into the weeds. All right, Jackie and then Hutch. Jackie, go ahead. Oh, I lost you. Where'd you go? Oh, Jacqueline, you're muted still. I'm sorry.
Why
Yeah.
was this built?
Yeah, good. So I
Other
think,
than-
go ahead.
That's it. Why was
Okay.
this built? Mhm.
So as always, I think that there are probably two different sides of it. One is the building of large structures for the glory of the human who builds it, and for the glory of the deity that it's meant to represent or to glorify, is just part of human nature. I think that there's something innate in us that makes us want to build structures. I don't know if it's an evolutionary thing or what, but you can see it in kids, and I think we rarely grow out of it. So building some sort of monument it was commonplace, and also just there's probably a reason that it's commonplace. Aside from that, the religious zeal of Solomon, of David before him, of those who said they wanted to build Yahweh a house, is I don't know, there's a witness to it in Scripture. And the interesting thing to me is that Yahweh really says that Yahweh doesn't want that. That Yahweh was perfectly happy moving around and didn't want to be contained somewhere. And then that suddenly seems to shift as Solomon says, no, I'm going to build a house. The storyteller even says that Solomon builds this house before he builds his own house, which I think is really interesting. So there does seem to be some sort of religious zeal that says this is the God who brought us out of Egypt, who has done all these amazing things for us, and God is deserving of a temple that is glorious. The one other thing that I'll say is, in this kind of theocratic increasingly bureaucratic nation state that's becoming, to have that building there is also to centralize power. And so as the temple grows, the side altars will decrease and people for all their religious and political purposes will need to come to Jerusalem. And so there's a pragmatism within that I'm not sure if it was driving what Solomon was doing. It probably was, but certainly will play out that way over the next several hundred years. In order for Jerusalem to truly be the capital, it has to be the center of religious, political, and economic power. Yeah, Jim, 1 second, please. Let me flip the camera over to you. I'm gonna get Jim and then come back to Hutch. All right, Jim, go right ahead.
The Jews aren't doing anything that other nations and other groups of people didn't do before them and have not done since.
Absolutely.
So there's nothing in that sense that's really extraordinary about what's happening.
No, that's right. That's right.
The other thing is that Solomon probably lived in David's house before he decided to build a new one for himself and his wife.
Sure. Yes. Okay, so Jim pointed out a couple things. You probably heard it. One is this isn't unique at all. It's unique in some of its structure, although even that's not terribly unique in every way. But every single society and culture goes about the public works of building great buildings and monuments. As long as humans have known how to lay stone on stone, we've been building ziggurats and all sorts of other stuff for the deity, for our own purposes, and we still do. It's just something we love to do. And again, I think that there's an embedded or evolved psychology there that says that we have to. We just can't help ourselves. But you're right in that it's not different. What's weird actually is that the Israelites are really late to the game. If this is 3,000 years ago, imagine how old the pyramids in Egypt are in comparison to this, right? The Egyptians beat them by a long way. Or if you go and look at the Akkadians and other Mesopotamian cultures, the fact that the Israelites are late to the building of big structures is really a witness to what a sort of nomadic group they remain in, a small ethnic group throughout this. This is the first time they've ever had the capacity to undertake a large public work. So really something there. Andy, one thing I want to make sure I say, you had the second question about the cube. We're going to have time, I think. I'll come back to the cube and to the fruit and some of the other things as we move forward. I just don't want you to think that I forgot about that. Hutch.
I found the architecture of the temple kind of interesting in that a basic, portable, much more simple version of the temple existed in the Exodus account as they were wandering in the desert, the tabernacle.
Yeah.
The tabernacle is really a simple model of this more elaborate temple, but it really leads you to wonder, did the tabernacle exist, or is the temple architecturally was designed from scratch and then the Exodus or writers created this tabernacle that's described in Exodus? And the reason I wonder about that, if you read this account of the tabernacle in Exodus, this thing was much too elaborate to be portable by a horde of people living a subsistent existence in the wilderness.
Right, good. So this is one of those mysteries that we can't quite get to the end of right now, but one thing that we know to be true is that between Chronicles, Kings, the tabernacle, and as it's described in the Pentateuch, and the prophet Ezekiel and some external writings, we end up with editors who are looking at multiple sources and they can't even understand what some of the architectural words mean. 500 years after Solomon builds this temple, somebody looking back at a statement about what he carved into a door and they can't understand what the word means because the language has shifted so much. And so they look at Ezekiel and they say, oh, well, Ezekiel said this about that same thing. And so let's combine those words. We end up with a really messy transmission that's intended to create some coordination between multiple sources, but it's so difficult as a result for us to say, well, is the is the tabernacle modeled upon Solomon's temple, or is Solomon's temple modeled on the tabernacle, or are both of them being described because of the way that Chronicles or Ezekiel describes, and are both of those referencing the second temple? Like, it's all just it's a big mess. Thank you for putting your thumb on the mess for us. That's really, really good. All right, Catherine.
I'm not going to say this eloquently, but what this passage is making me think of is just the importance of place, you know, like even thinking back to Abraham creating his altars as he went, you know, that I think like when we talk about the particularity of the building, to me, it feels sacramental almost, is that we have this human nature desire to have outward and visible symbols and things, tangible things that we can touch to point toward something mysterious and invisible, you know? So I think like Brueggemann has this concept of like the scandal of particularity. It kind of reminds, like, especially as we talk about how specific the measurements were and all that stuff. So I just think there might be something more to contemplate than just the power and the symbol of the place of worship.
Yeah, very good. And not only does that exist now, but really that pulls us back into the conversation about why a cube, why the fruit, why these things, that all these things are, especially for a society that is forbidden from doing too much anthropomorphizing or having graven images or something along those lines. How do they represent visually what they believe to be true about this place, if this is God's dwelling place on earth? And so over the process of building, they end up building something that represents paradise and a multi-layered way of entering back into paradise where God dwells. But that place is shrouded in darkness and no one's allowed to go there. And so they absolutely are saying so much about, it is an absolute manifestation of the cultic mindset. And that's, again, the cultic mindset being a technical term. I don't mean cult like you think of your average cult, but instead the mindset of worshipers, right? That God is shrouded in darkness, but God dwells in this place. And our entering into this place is somehow to leave the ordinary world behind through these gates of holiness and meet God in the place where God is on earth. It's extraordinary. It really is quite extraordinary. And not only does it continue in architecture, the major streams of architecture, religious architecture afterwards, but it also points then to when the second temple is destroyed finally between 70 and 115 AD, and the Jewish people no longer have a temple. God's dwelling place on earth is gone. There's no more access to that place. When all that happens, Judaism has to be a different kind of Judaism from that point on. Judy and I were talking about this a little bit at the end of the last class, that I think it's the last class, that rabbinic Judaism is born out of that catastrophe because of how important this sacramental space is. So it's a really good concept to hold. And that is, Andy, why there's a perfect cube. The perfection of that cube is, and its proportion is supposed to be a way of speaking of God's own perfection. Gets represented again in Revelation with the coming down of that cube. Okay, I want to push through the text real quick so we don't lose our progress for the day. We want to talk about cherubim for sure. So the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. And again, 10 cubits being more than 1.5 feet each probably. That's 15 feet high for the statue itself. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub. 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. You get the scale. These are large statues. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of the one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house. The wings of the cherubim were spread out, so the wing of one was touching one wall, and the wing of the other cherub was touching the other wall. Their other wings toward the center of the house were touching wing to wing. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. Carved the walls of the house all around with carved engravings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor of the house was overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. He covered the 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So also he made for the entrance to the nave doorposts of olive wood, 4-sided each, and 2 doors of cypress wood, and 2 leaves of the one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, overlaying them with gold, evenly applied upon the carved work. He built the inner court with 3 courses of dressed stone to 1 course of cedar beams. In the 4th year of the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid, in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts, according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. 7, great biblical number there. And Ziv is the month, the 2nd month, that's the month following Nisan. So if you think it's the month following Easter, that's probably the easiest way to think about that. It's the spring. And then, yeah, month of Bul is in the 8th month, so harvest time in the fall. And 7 years is, a good biblical number. We also had that at the beginning. 480 years is 40 times 12. That's a good biblical number. Okay. What did you see there? Especially related to the way in which this place is meant to sacramentally, so to speak, embody something of what they intend to be the understanding from a religious perspective or from a theological perspective. Yeah, Judy, give me 1 second. Let me turn the camera to you.
Oh, I just have a simple question.
Okay.
The significance of all these cherubim.
Yes.
What is that?
Great question. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. So what's the significance of cherubim? We really have done a disservice to the word cherubim by making it all about like little Cupid looking things. That is not at all what the ancient world believed to be true about cherubim. So I thought I would pull up a couple of pictures that I grabbed before the class, anticipating just such a question. Here are some pictures. A cherubim, the word cherubim probably comes from the ancient Canaanite word, which means mount. And by mount, I mean like horse, but was always described as having wings, was typically described as having various types of faces, sometimes multiple faces, lion and human face, and goat and other things. This is a Lamassu. So this is almost the same period of time. There are a lot of these from the ancient Near Eastern world. We don't have cherubim from ancient Israel, unfortunately. Here is another depiction of a multi-winged creature called a cherub. I don't think this is the right way of looking at it, primarily because every reference to cherubim is, what would we say, quadrupedal, right? It's always going on all fours with multiple wings. And so, so this probably isn't quite the right way of looking at it, but you can still see this is a formidable figure. Here is another, this is probably, oh, well, that's scary. Sort of sphinx-like, that's an appropriate way of thinking about it. Quadrupedal, it is a steed or a mount, winged, fierce, large. And then I'll show you one more just to give a sense of, this is Marduk, the Babylonian god, sun god, chasing down the child of Tiamat, the serpent chaos monster. As you can see, chaos monster, this is the child of the chaos monster even more. But this kind of griffin-like, sphinx-like thing is where we're going. That's where your concept should be, is that these massive 15-foot tall or 18-foot tall statues of horrible creatures are inside this place. And in the ancient world, they were there not only to be seen and understood to be the presence of the deity, because the deity would ride these creatures, but also they had this sort of protective, almost like gargoyle type importance, that anybody who walked into that place who didn't already know you better be pretty reverent in this place would look up at the 15-foot tall Sphinx and say, maybe I'll be quiet and respectful in this place. And so yeah, pretty amazing. And they are everywhere. It's not just here. They're going to be carved into the walls and doors and so on and so forth. So, so you have these giant statues, but you also, everywhere you look, you're going to see this fierce creature. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. So ultimately, these cherubs end up being understood to be angelic and have other roles. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, this angelic creature was intended to somewhat be terrifying also. Scott Simcoe.
Yeah, just to follow on what my notes say, a fantastic composite creature on which God was sometimes thought to ride. And in the temple, they served as guardians of the divine presence.
We should have just turned to your notes. That's much more efficient than what I said.
Could have saved you time.
That's right. That's very good. Yes. Those are good notes. That's one of those things that I really didn't understand at all until I got to seminary. But we had somebody teach a class on angels in the ancient Near Eastern world who had a PhD in the subject, and it was really eye-opening. Just so much of what we believe about angels came so late in comparison to where our biblical texts were. Okay, so one last thing I want to say about cherubim, though, is if we think about this as paradise on earth, what does God do with the gates of paradise when he kicks the first humans out? Anybody remember?
Yeah, he has it guarded, right, by the.
Yes, indeed. There's a flaming sword and an angel guarding the way. Let's see, Genesis 3. Okay, verse 24, the very last verse of chapter 3 here in Genesis. He drove out the man at the east of the Garden of Eden. He placed a cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. So just thinking about the way in which the palm trees and the pomegranates and the fruit and everything that's there about the garden and these angelic, terrifying guardians are there. You can really get a sense that the pilgrim coming in or the priest coming in or whoever's coming into this place is going to understand that they are at some level entering into this almost Eden-like environment in which God dwells. It's kind of cool. Okay, did you see anything else that you want to lift out? Okay, the one, oh, yep, Louise, I see you.
I just saw with the amount of detail, and it was really a lot of work of workmen's hands, laying layers of this and gold and all that. And the fact that later it says that it took 7 years, that I thought this was really a good sign of two things. One, the stability that we started with about hope and not having any more to wander around or be dispersed by war or taken by enemies or any of that. And so the fact that they actually, I mean, that's another answer to Jackie's question, I think, of why was it built? Because all of the reasons that we've already discussed were there. Humans like to build. It's a wonderful thing to be able to honor God with something that you've made. But this was described so in detail that I think it showed me both the stability and the peace and the repressed desire to have something that they could do with the work of their hands, almost as their own sacrifice to God through work and
Yeah,
through
very cool.
and through, the richness that they had. Whatever they had, the best was going to go there.
Yeah.
So that's the
Yeah.
only thing that jumped out at me, that
That's a
about
great,
the peace and the hope and why they built it.
that's a really, really good point. Yes, if they were at war, all the funding would get diverted to the military and supplying food to the front lines and so on and so forth. So these types of public works only happen when there is relative peace. Rome is probably the society that we know best as it relates to some of this stuff, because there's so much rioting. The Pax Romana provided not only the means from a taxation standpoint, but also the relative peace that allows for this explosion in public works in and around Rome and throughout the empire. And it's only as Rome has to fight the barbarians, to use their own language, that we really start to see huge funding diverted to the front lines and the supplying for the legions and so on and so forth to be able to keep up the war. And so, and not just the barbarians, they were fighting on multiple fronts. So for 7 years, which again is a great biblical number, for that to be a period of peace. And then that's going to be followed up with the building of the palace, which takes an additional, I think, 13 years. So 20 years of total peace, as far as we know, in which they can undertake this building project. It's a great thing to notice. Really, really good.
I think we can also say, in a more philosophical sense, that peace entails building up and war entails breaking down.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very interesting. I like that. In most cases, it's probably true. All right, good. Anything else? Robin?
Somebody's dancing.
Yeah. Robin, we can only see that if I happen to be on the right screen when you're doing it. So there's a raise my hand button that you're going to want to learn about sometime. If you'll unmute yourself, though, you can go ahead.
Okay, this sort of strikes me as, the fervence of it and everything, like idolatry.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's
because
a way.
God's supposed to be everywhere.
Right.
And so why are we just sort of narrowing it down to this one place?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a critique that the Bible raises itself, that there is a level of this that was not the design of God from the perspective of the type of relationship that God wanted with the people, that God wanted to be everywhere and not located in one place. Humanity wanted it differently, and God said, okay, fine, I'll give you what you want, but there's a consequence to it. And so it's a really helpful thing. And then that question will remain an important question for even Christianity afterwards. So one question is, what do we do with art? And what do we do with architecture as it relates to our understanding of idolatry? And so just as an example, I think it's the Council of Toledo, perhaps, not Ohio, where they talk a lot about the difference between veneration and worship. And they because some are saying, well, if you see Christian art, an icon, we're not supposed to have graven images, and so we can't you can't bow down to an icon, you can't pray with an icon or whatever, and you can't do that with the architecture in church and all this sort of stuff. And so what the council ends up determining is that there's a really distinct difference between passing our prayer and our worship through something physical to God, and the sort of reverse of something that's sacramental. Something that's sacramental conveys God's grace to us through the tangible or physical. And this way, we convey something back to God through it. That's veneration. And God is the only recipient of worship. And some never accepted that as a meaningful distinction. And so, we have a history that extends from that point on for another 1,000 years, 800 years or more of iconoclasm, the destruction of art, the destruction of monasteries, and so on and so forth. It's really it's It's not within the scope of our class necessarily, but that debate actually still rages on. It really does. Good. Okay. We are a few minutes after, as we normally are. And so I'm going to do a couple things. First of all, sign off on the YouTube stream. God bless you all. Thanks for being with us today. And we'll see you again soon. If you are interested in ever joining the Zoom class or the in-person class, and if you aren't receiving our emails about this class, reach out to me. It's rslone@christepiscopalchurch.org, and I'll get you on that list.